Welcome to today's PERVADE in Conversation series and our discussion with Dr. Mark Dredze. My name is Michael Zimmer. I'm an associate professor in computer science at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I also direct our Center for Data Ethics and Society. Most of my work focuses on issues of data ethics, internet research ethics, and big data, and I'm one of the principal investigators in the PERVADE project. The PERVADE project is a six-institution, large research grant focused on answering empirical questions around data ethics and big data research. We're funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, and we're studying how people react to what we call pervasive data being used in research. Big data about people, about us. We're interested in how data scientists are grappling with ethical questions within their work, how regulators, policymakers, even institutional review boards assess and guide this kind of research. We also study the actual subjects and users of these platforms to try to get better understanding of how they feel and what awareness they have of how their data might be used in large-scale data-intensive projects. It's been an exciting project, and we are in our final years, and we are starting to now have these conversations. We are trying to reach out to other scholars that are doing cutting edge work in the space of data science, AI, machine learning, and data ethics to try to gain insights into their own experiences, their own challenges, and some of the ways that they think about some of the ethical dimensions in this kind of space. So the conversation today, we have an hour blocked for this. We have some questions that I want to ask Professor Dredze. We have a Q&A function set up on the Zoom, so you should be able to submit questions that way, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. This webinar will be recorded and posted online as well, and so we can continue conversations in other ways through our commenting functions or on Twitter or wherever it is you might find any of us in order to engage with. So we're lucky today to be joined with Professor Mark Dredze, who's the John C. Malone Associate Professor of Computer Science at Johns Hopkins University, where he's also affiliated with the Malone Center for Engineering and Healthcare, the Center for Language and Speech Processing, and various other units on that campus. He obtained his PhD from University of Pennsylvania in 2009, and his research works in the space of statistical models, natural language processing, and machine learning, engaging in social media analyses in the spaces of public health and clinical informatics. His work includes focus on issues like tobacco control, vaccination, infectious disease surveillance. These are all topics that are clearly on our minds over the past couple of years. Mental health, drug use, and gun violence prevention. Working largely in spaces involving natural language processing and working on other kinds of models to help improve health outcomes through the use of data. Mark, I think you and I probably first met about a year ago. We were on a workshop together on the ethical implications for online research that was hosted by the American Public Health Association. And we were talking about a lot of these issues with a lot of different stakeholders during that day. I was excited to be able to have the opportunity to invite you to come have this conversation, to talk a little bit more about your work, some of the things that you're working on. I think there's some really interesting intersections with not only what the PERVADE project is doing broadly, but even some of the work that me and some of the students in my lab are doing. So I'm just looking forward to this time we have together today, and I really appreciate you making the time to share your insights with the PERVADE team and our broader community. So I wanted to just start off by letting you talk about your own research. What kind of excites you in this space? What are some of the big issues, challenges that you're seeing in the broad sense when we're dealing with these issues of data ethics and big data?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I work on a number of different things. At the center of my work is a set of computer science techniques within the field of artificial intelligence that comprise a set of algorithms for analyzing language data. And so the intersection of that with topics of ethics comes from a number of different sources. So one is that more and more these systems are actually being deployed and used in ways that impact people's lives. You can think of all the ways in which you interact with systems that are intelligent now, whether that's through Siri or Alexa, or going on Google, or any number of things where we're actually interacting with these intelligent agents, or letting intelligent algorithms make decisions about what information we consume, et cetera. So that raises a number of ethical issues. There's also issues about the data that we use in those processes. So how we collect data from people, and how people share data with us, and what rights and responsibilities that data comes with. So that's kind of one area. And the other area is I do a lot of stuff with health, both public health and clinical medicine. And I think in the clinical space, we have a pretty good handle on ethics. That's been a long-running topic for decades and centuries, and so certainly there are a lot of new and interesting challenges today. But it's a field where we have, I think, a very mature understanding of ethics in medicine. In public health, there are a lot of things that we're doing now that are really new and different, and those raise interesting ethical issues. So I do a lot of work with using online data from, for example, social media sources to inform public health, and that includes things that can be sensitive, such as vaccinations, HIV and AIDS, and in particular, developing algorithms to aid in the diagnosis, treatment, and understanding of mental health disorders. So ethics comes up in many different ways. And I think it's growing in terms of the number of areas I work on that touch on ethics, as there's a broader understanding of the seriousness of the issues that we are now encountering.
Yeah, I think that's what you're describing is one of the really interesting challenges that we're having of some traditions of research that have a long history of dealing with ethics and research and protecting subjects and those kinds of things, especially in health-related research. But now suddenly this injection of new sources of data, new types of data, or granularity of data are creating some really interesting new challenges. Can you talk a little bit about or provide an example of the type of data that you might be using in some of these projects, or where you're getting it from, or how it's being collected?
Sure. So I use lots of kinds of data. I think the data that is perhaps most sensitive, but where we have the best understanding, would be clinical notes. So this is things in the electronic medical record that a doctor writes about a patient. So those are obviously going to be the most sensitive. It contains protected health information, but those are also the areas where we have the best understanding of what are the implications, what are the relevant ethics and privacy issues. The regulatory system there is the most well-developed. Thinking of things like HIPAA. So I think, like, in some sense, that's the easiest place to operate. The other areas are really drawing data from online sources. So this might be looking at social media platforms. So people are posting to Facebook or Twitter or Reddit, and we want to use that data in some way. It might be other kinds of interactions with online systems. It might be just writing content and posting it online, whether that's on social media platforms, but we can extend that to blogs, or really any of the ways people post contents online. I think that most people probably don't fully realize how much of this data is used and what are the diverse ways in which it is used. And so that has really been certainly new in the public health space over the last decade, but it is happening across the field of AI with increasing regularity.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we've been seeing in some of our findings, talking with researchers, talking with subjects and regulators alike, is the current gold standard, or at least the historical approach on addressing a lot of these ethical issues, comes down to consent. And if we get consent from subjects to run an experiment or conduct a survey or an interview or some kind of intervention, then we have permission to use this data and to do what we need to do with it. How does consent play out in some of your work? And have you struggled with consent? Does it not apply because of the type of data or work you're doing? Or how do you see that within your domain?
Yeah, so informed consent is both very helpful and not relevant. So let me take both angles. So it's very helpful because I think it's fairly easy to say that certainly in the medical side, informed consent is the gold standard and is the standard by which all studies are held up against, right? There is an expectation that you will be obtaining informed consent. And if it's not the case, then there needs to be some explanation or justification as why. And I think it's just worth realizing that while that is universal now, that was at one point controversial. The idea that you'd have to disclose to a participant in a study that they were in a study, what the study was doing, give them a choice. Like for a long time, those were not expectations. And there was an argument against making that an expectation for all studies. And that is where we are now. I think history has sided with this being the right standard, but it's important to remember that this is not an obvious standard. This is a standard that took a lot of people a long period of time to really win over the community that this was the appropriate thing. So in some sense, it's great because now we have the standard where we can compare things to and we can apply. On the other hand, there are exceptions to this. So one of the exceptions is public data, right? So the idea would be that, for example, if like I want to go to the park and count how many people had umbrellas and how many people didn't have umbrellas, I don't need to tell everyone entering the park that that I was doing that, right? Or if someone conducted a survey and they had the survey approved and then they published the results of the survey, I don't need to go back and ask everyone who's in that survey for the permission to do some analysis on the data, right? So when online data came up in the arena where IRBs were operating, because a lot of it is not in that arena, so I'm specifically talking about in the health case, there was this initial question about where it falls, right? Like what kind of data is this? And determination was made early on that this is really a public data, right? This data is freely available online. People post it of their own volition. And so really what's just changed here is how easy the data is to access and how much of it there is, but nothing else is really different. And so that is the framework where we operated for a long time. And so in some sense, the rules about informed consent were really helpful, but I think they sent us in the wrong direction, right? Because there was an assumption made that, well, since this is exempt, you really can do anything, right? And that's where I think we really ran into problems, because I don't think that is the right way to think about it. So we have this problem where people who are posting data sometimes might say, I don't want my data to be used for this purpose. But in the old framework of exemptions from consent, that there is no mechanism for that, right? You can't participate in a survey or you can't go to the park and say, you know what, no one can use my walking through the park in a study, right? Like you don't have that ability. And so, for the park, that seems like, okay, yeah, so that's not appropriate. But for online data, maybe there is a domain of which the people posted should have a say over what's going on. So I think it really pointed us in the wrong direction for a long time. And now the community is actively trying to figure out, like, well, what are the right parameters? And that turns out to be very challenging to do.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question about, is there indication that these norms are starting to change a little bit? I mean, we've seen similar reactions. We've published some work where we looked at people who are using Reddit data as their primary data source, and it spans all different kinds of disciplines and studies. But by and large, those who talk to an IRB, the IRB said this is public data. I mean, assuming these are open Reddit threads, and you don't need to get consent. It's an exempt study. And then the subset, and it was a relatively small subset of the publications that we analyzed, the researchers acknowledged that, but still recognized there were some unique ethical challenges here. Like, even though my IRB said I could go ahead and do this without concern, we took the following steps because we're particularly concerned I might be studying the R depression subreddit or something where there's some sensitive or vulnerable communities. Are you seeing a shift in this conversation among researchers within your space? Are you and your team kind of out in front of this, or just how do you see that kind of playing out within the community itself?
Yeah, so there's definitely been a shift. There's no question about that. I think while originally maybe the focus was on what are we legally allowed to do and what would the IRB allow us to do, I think there's now, I think, a widespread realization by people who think about this, that the legal what you are legally permitted or not permitted to do is really just a starting point of the conversation. That shouldn't be where it ends in any sense. And that IRBs are uninformed about this topic, and relying on their judgment is ill-advised. It's an important review process, but assuming that the IRB is going to uncover the problems, like the IRB is not a mythical board. The IRB is made up of people. It is, in most cases, true that the IRBs are made up of people who have no experience working with this online data. They don't know what's in it. And so the idea that they are the right ones to set the rules doesn't make any sense. So I think we're at that point where we recognize those limitations, and we're trying to figure out what the limitations should be. I think, for example, there's a number of studies asking users, what are your perceptions? What do you want to see have happen? That's not, I don't think, what should define what we do. But I think it's an important part of trying to figure out what the balance is. I think that some people are really engaged in talking to domain practitioners. So I work in public health. So talking to people who are not on the data side, but actually work in public health and saying like, well, what do you need? What are the concerns? I think we're trying to balance all these sides here, right? So it's easy to say, don't do work. But there's always a cost to doing the work or not doing the work. And so trying to better understand all these factors are really important. I think we have some standards I think we've agreed on. I think many people understand now that certain things would be considered inappropriate. We have better protections on sharing data that I think many people follow, or sharing models. We have better protections on how we might engage with the community if people are seeking to develop techniques that engage with the population. How to include things in publications, what to disclose. So I think we've made a lot of progress. I think it's definitely true that the people who are actively thinking and working on this are very far ahead of people who don't. And so you see a lot of examples of people who are doing things that I think 5 years ago I might have been comfortable doing, but I'm not comfortable anymore. And there are still people who are there, and I'm hoping we kind of bring everyone along. So I think we're making a lot of progress. I don't think yet we have it all figured out by a long shot. And I think there's still a lot of debate. There's a lot of debate where some people will say like, we don't think that kind of work is acceptable, and other people say we think it is. And I don't think it's obvious who's right. I think we're still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I think that resonates with a lot of what we're seeing in other spaces as well. And what I think is well, from my perspective, a unique challenge, perhaps in the work that you're doing, is this balance between what you're capable of achieving, the kind of data you have access to, and what's kind of appropriate. Or you mentioned earlier whether or not people were sharing information online with a particular expectation or in a particular context. And so, for example, if I'm posting something on Twitter about a medical condition that I'm having, do I have certain expectations that even though this is a public tweet, I don't think it's going to be suddenly used to profile me or do other things. This is me just communicating on this platform. But in the case of a lot of your research, you're not trying to build models so Twitter or Facebook can target an ad to a person. You're trying to solve public health problems. Like there's a value, there's a broader social goal in the kind of research you're describing, where perhaps other research spaces might be trying to solve some interesting technical problem, but maybe not, reaching that kind of a more, I don't want to say lofty, but a broader social good. Do those kinds of conversations play out in these discussions? I mean, I'm wondering if there's these kinds of debates that, like I know that maybe this doesn't fly, but this is how we can help deal with this challenge of mental health online or drug abuse, and therefore we should be given a little bit more latitude, where perhaps just someone trying to train an algorithm to guess someone's sexuality, shouldn't be allowed to do that, but we have a different kind of end game. Is that part of that conversation in terms of how we deal with data? Yeah.
So it certainly is. I think I'll just bring up one point that was mentioned that you said at the end, which is how the end goals play into the type of work itself. So for example, let's take something, guessing someone's sexuality, right? There's certainly papers that have done this, and we can have a conversation not now about whether or not that's a good idea or not. But suffice it to say that clearly some people think that's a terrible idea, we shouldn't be doing it. And the evidence of papers on this topic suggests that some people think it's fine. Right. So there are different reasons you could do this. All right. One is to target ads. We'll put that somewhere in the middle of the spectrum of good and evil. Sometimes I get ads I really like, sometimes I don't. There's many reasons why targeting ads based on someone's sexuality would be a bad idea. Okay. There's kind of all the way on the bad end of the spectrum, which would be, trying to do something malicious to people who have certain identifications. I think, okay, malicious means it's really bad. But then the other end of the spectrum is there are people in public health who are focused, for example, on like health disparities, right? And so one topic right now is specifically looking at disparities of transgendered individuals who have a real significant number of problems with the healthcare system in the United States that leads to lots of really bad outcomes, right? And so there's lots of people trying to improve that, and identifying those individuals and their experiences is part of that, right? So again, let's leave it as an open question whether or not there's an appropriate piece of technology, but does it matter why you're developing the technology that gives you license to do it or not? So if I say, oh, well, my end goal is to do the good thing, and I have an NIH grant to do the good thing, and I'm working with people to do the good thing, does that mean that what I'm doing is okay? Does that mean I can release a system that other people can use, or do I have to control the releasing of the system? If I'm someone who says, well, I have no NIH grant, I just think there's an interesting problem, and maybe someone who has that NIH grant could use what I'm doing, do you have license to do it? Should that matter, right? Should it just be like that we agree that this is something that could be appropriate in some circumstances, and that opens the door to everyone to do it? And I don't think we really understand how to draw those lines yet. And I think you see this, there's a lot of debate around these types of applications of whether or not they're appropriate, inappropriate, who should have a say in this. I think it's still very much an open debate. I think there are some cases that are obviously bad, and everyone agrees those are bad, and we want to prevent those from happening. But those are kind of easy to spot. I think there's a real debate. Simply, if you look at the literature and how it shifts over time, things that were happening 5-10 years ago in the literature that now you don't see papers on, where there's been a realization of, oh, well, maybe this isn't a good idea, we shouldn't be doing it. That kind of rapid shift suggests at the level of ambiguity here, where people are really trying to figure out what the right thing to do is.
Yeah, this seems like such a critical challenge, and we see this a lot, like with the emotion detection and these other kinds of things, where we could see all kinds of really positive reasons why it might be helpful for a platform like Instagram to recognize whether or not a user is feeling depressed right now. But we certainly don't want them to be able to target that user to try to trigger some impulsive behavior. I've been doing some work trying to help a team that's doing natural language processing and other related work, looking at electronic health records, but also public data for prediction of suicide ideation. And again, a very important public health goal to try to, if we can create predictive models to do this, but there's always this concern about misuse or downstream use or other unanticipated consequences. And I think this connects to one theme that we've seen in a lot of our findings on the PERVADE team, that a lot of this boils down to questions of power, and how researchers, may suddenly have a form of power over subjects through their data in ways that are often invisible. And I just wanted to ask if questions of power, and I guess maybe on the flip side, justice. You mentioned about how do we improve health outcomes for vulnerable communities, and that's a question of justice. And how can we have the work that we're doing through data analytics achieve those goals of justice without creating some kind of power imbalances? And I'm just, again, curious to see if those are some of the issues that also resonate within your own work or the broader community.
Yeah, so I think the issues of power and justice are are quite present and very complicated. So looking at technology as a whole and the internet, I think the internet has done two things simultaneously. One is it has given the individual tremendous amounts of power that they would never have had in the past. And just think of how many times we've had like a national movement or something like a protest movement, public PR campaign start from a single individual, right? And that individual has tremendous power to get their message out, speak directly with people. I mean, I can write a tweet that is free, and if the right people see it and it resonates with enough people, it could become something that really shapes dialogue in this country or any other country. That is a tremendous amount of power that this technology is given to the individual. At the same time, it is given a tremendous amount of power to companies and governments. And you see many instances of governments completely controlling the dialogue within within their country, or persecuting individuals based on tremendous access they have to information about that person. You see whether or not we want to say whether it's been used for good or bad, like the power that Facebook has is really tremendous, right? And in many ways, it exceeds the power of any government. And that is unusual, right? For a company, back in, 50 years ago, GM did not have that level of power. Okay. So those things are in some sense a contradiction because, I'm talking about power to the individual and power to, an organization, but they're both present, right? Yeah. And that means that when we develop new technologies, they are contributing to both. And I don't know how you develop, I don't think we've ever found a way to develop a new technology and control the way it's going to be used, right? You have some ability to control the dialogue around it, and some ability to control the direction of development. But if something becomes popular, you have very little say about how people are going to use it, how people are going to develop it. And so I think that's really challenging. Does that mean that we should be, not developing things? Because while there's many good uses for them, there are also harms, and we enable both. Does it mean that we have less responsibility because we have, like maybe we should just give up and say, like, I can't control what Facebook's going to do. This might help Facebook. This might also help, Habitat for Humanity. And so, like, there's something I can do. I don't know. I think being much more aware of these issues is something that we're really focusing on now. But if you just look in the academic communities, we haven't figured this out. So I'll just give one example. In a number of communities within the AI field, program committees are trying to figure out how people should be responsibly thinking about issues of ethics and the broader implications of their work. And this has ranged from ethics reviews, mandatory ethics statements, optional ethics statements, checklists, disclosure of IRB, and you can just look at how many different things have been tried and how it's changed year to year to get a sense that, like, we really just don't know yet how to do this and how to figure it out. Is including an ethics statement as a mandatory thing going to mean that people are change the things they work on? Maybe, maybe not. Is that our goal? Is it just awareness? Like, I think we're really trying to figure this out. There are people who have spent way more time in this than I have. And I don't think there's obvious answers. So I think it's totally reasonable to try out different things and see what's going on. But this is not an issue in the rearview mirror. This is like every year to year, this is an active area of discussion that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, and I've been involved in ethics review for conferences and things where we've had those different kinds of models where maybe there's a checkbox that they click when they submit a paper, maybe they're forced to write an ethics statement. And as you can imagine, you see all different kinds of levels of engagement with that, where the ethics statement is just a mere exercise, or it's really in detail. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, the training that people have, and perhaps their disciplinary background or whatever their upbringing was, in an academic sense. I'm working in the Department of Computer Science where we're training computer science and data scientists. I am not a computer scientist. I work in ethics, but I'm here to help train these students to give them that exposure so they can start thinking about these questions early on, even in their undergraduate stages. And I'm curious to see how this might, how do these discussions play out in your department or in your lab? Are you engaging with your students? How what are the things that you're doing to try to help push this awareness forward?
Yeah, so let me say something on the last topic and I'll tie it into
Yeah.
this question of students. So I'll give you another example where I think values are in conflict. So one of the values right now in the academic research community is to broaden access to the community. And that is both thinking about underrepresented groups within, like, for example, the United States and other, Western European countries, and ensuring that they have access to the community, but also thinking internationally. We historically do not have conferences in Africa or South America as a whole continent. And there are some exceptions, but like that is largely the rule. Yeah. Combine that with visa policies, travel costs, et cetera, we are really excluding large amounts of the world from participating in research. And that's a problem because the technology we're developing is not going to stay in the countries where it's being developed. It spreads throughout the world. At the same time, the ethical standards and ethical views dramatically vary between countries, right? So if we want to increase dramatically the involvement of, for example, participants from Africa as a continent, do we also think that those that ethical standards present within those countries should have equal say to the ethical standards in the United States, right? And because there are varying standards, we are opening that door in ways that maybe we're not happy with as well. Those are two things that are in contrast. So you see this in educational goals as well, because just like we're trying to open the research community to a diverse range of people, we're trying to open the classroom to a diverse range of people, right? And we are constantly looking to diversify the student body of our institutions. And I think that's great, and that's a great goal. And so it means that when you discuss these issues in the classroom, you have a range of views. But it also is the case that those range of views are pushing us in directions sometimes that in this conversation, we might not be happy doing, right? Because, for example, many people come from countries with what we would consider to be oppressive governments, and not everyone in that country is obviously happy with it. In large part, many people in the country accept that as a perfectly fine standard to operate. And so we're saying that, okay, well, we want to develop this technology, but we don't want to let certain governments use it in certain ways, right? Well, if people from those governments are attending classes and attending the community, right, it changes the whole conversation. I will say that broadly speaking, I am very reassured when I talk to students, because I think students generally have good instincts about this. Having I think there's this disconnect between the people who produce the data and the people who do research on the data, and a lot of that production is happening in the younger population. And so I think they often have really good instincts about this, and that's very encouraging. At the same time, we really do need to educate, because usually they're not aware of the ethical issues, right? So they have good instincts, but having good instincts does not mean you make great decisions, right? You need to provide that kind of framework in educational, like, well, how do you make decisions here? What are the standards to apply? And I think once they have that, they end up, I think, with pretty good instincts. And I think in some sense that's happened in the research community as well, where younger researchers have really sounded the alarm of serious issues to older researchers. And I think that's part of education as well, as having that conversation and having both sides learn something, right? Trying to teach what are the frameworks and how do we make decisions, but also learning, as someone who teaches, like learning what those issues might be, what are the sensitivities, what's in this data that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, I think one of these challenges that you're pointing to, I've seen as well, where I can have the conversation in my classroom and we could talk in the abstract about what it means to be collecting data or using data or building models for these kinds of ways. But once my student graduates and becomes an entry level, software engineer at Apple, they're just a small piece of this larger organization. So how do they actually enact that kind of change or bring that kind of ethical awareness to be effective in their space? And I'm wondering if are there any resources that you think we still need to develop? Like, are there things, toolkits or some kind of things that we should be developing either within the research community or even in the professional community to help sort of guide this decision-making processes that people are going to have to confront themselves with?
Yeah, yes, certainly. So I'll give an analogy to, let's just say, math, right? So one of the challenges that students have in math is they take calculus, 1, 2, 3, whatever, and they do well, they get A's, okay. But in calculus, you're told, here's an equation, take the derivative, and it has a logarithm in it, because that's what we just learned in the past 2 weeks in class, right? So in some sense, you are good at applying things that you're told to apply. When you get to other classes, you're given a proof and you don't really know how to go about it. And someone says, oh, well, remember you learned this rule in your calculus class. And a lot of students are like, oh, I didn't realize that this is where I should use it. So it's a problem of taking what you learn in class and applying it. This is certainly true of ethics, right? So when I have the discussion of, let's now discuss like a case study in ethics, right? So everyone knows that's what we're talking about and thinking about.
Yeah.
When you're at a job and someone's like, oh, in the next version of this tool, we should have it do this. You're not primed to think in that way. And so I think like that's really a challenge. So we've done a lot in education to try and take math out of calculus alone and try and help students see how to apply it, right? And we need to come up with the same sorts of techniques for ethics, not just in the class called computer science ethics or ethics of computer scientists, or in my lecture called ethics, right? It needs to be better integrated. So that's something I'm trying to do in my class right now, which is not to show that ethics is like an add-on step, but it is a critical part in all the decision-making, and decisions that you make about other things that seem really technical do have implications for issues of ethics and fairness and transparency and such. So I think we need to figure out like how to teach this stuff and integrate it. I think we're doing better at having a checkbox that says we cover ethics in this program. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of producing students who can comfortably work with it in the sense of recognize when those things come up and how to deal with them, which I think is a whole different level of challenge.
Yeah, this is something that one of my colleagues on the PERVADE project, Casey Fiesler out in Colorado, and her team have been studying, how does ethics show up in computer science and data science curriculum? And, literally some of these are like week 15, if we get to it, and then there's the ethics module, which is not exactly how we want to have this framed. And that's that challenge about integrating it throughout, or is it its own thing? And I think we're all as a community still trying to work through what are the best approaches there. I guess probably both, but we all know we have limited resources to pull these things off. I do just want to remind our attendees that there is the Q&A function. If you do want to post any questions, feel free to do that, and we will try to get to those as best we can. What are some other challenges? Are there things that we haven't talked about yet, Mark, that you're seeing in your work that are on the horizon that we're going to have to start thinking about in terms of some of the broader ethical challenges of dealing with data and public health?
Yeah, I think this is something we're starting, you will see it in public health. We're starting to see it in the broader field of AI, which is, this conversation and most of our conversations are focused on data, like taking the data, using that data, and the ethics of that. I think the other aspect of it is, what do we do with the systems we develop and how people interact with those systems? And I think that we are just scratching the surface of understanding people's perceptions around what we're going to be deploying, right? And I say perceptions because what matters is not what we're doing. What matters is what people perceive we're doing. I guess, let me clarify. It matters what we're doing, obviously.
Right.
But I'm saying that, like, if we do everything right and people perceive that we're not doing everything right, that's a big problem, right? And we already see many small cases of this. So I remember, listening many years ago when Gmail started showing ads, right? And people's complaints, and to be clear, like Gmail at that time and many of these services were building ads based on the email in front of them. They weren't trying to build ads based on like your web search behavior or something, right? And then critically, it was all computers doing it. It wasn't, no one was reading your email to do it. But people often perceived that there was some violation of privacy, either by going beyond email or someone like literally reading your emails, right? And so the effect was people's perceptions were that there was some violation. And you know, I'm sure we've all heard of these examples. Someone would say like, oh, well, I went to this restaurant last night, or better yet, like I was talking to my friend over lunch where we should go out to eat, and they suggested this restaurant, and then Gmail showed me an ad for that same restaurant after lunch, right? And to the best of my knowledge, like Google isn't listening in on your lunch conversations and then building ads, right? Like that's not happening. What's much more likely to happen is Gmail shows you thousands of ads, and that one you notice because of this kind of thing. So perception is really important. And I don't think we really understand how people are going to perceive some of the technologies we're developing. And I think that that is going to be a big issue in terms of the acceptance of these technologies and their effectiveness. And I don't think we're really understanding what those issues are going to be. Certainly in the broader AI space, I think that's true. In the public health space, I think I haven't really heard these types of conversations, and I don't really know where they'd come up and what the issues are going to be. So you know, I do a lot of work, as I said, like in the mental health space. Lots of people do. You know, what are the kinds of things that we would deploy that a person might see, and how might they interact with it? And we have a couple examples of Facebook and some other companies doing a little bit in this space and seeing the kind of backlash that there's been. And I don't think we really understand those issues yet. And that's going to be a major, major factor.
I think an interesting challenge there as well is differential impacts on different communities. We had done some research over the past year on how different underserved communities in Southeast Wisconsin perceive the value of AI as it relates to COVID and health, and basically the delivery of healthcare during a pandemic. And we found we had done interviews with members of the Hispanic community, African American, Native, and South Asians. And there's a whole level of trust that has to be overcome. There's a whole level of technical proficiency that has to be overcome before you even get to the perception of how data is being used. And I'm wondering, are those some issues in terms of when we think about public health? I think it's easy to think about it as this big, large thing, and we're gonna help public health, and it's gonna help everyone. But clearly, different communities might be impacted differently through these kinds of technologies. Is that something that you're seeing as a challenge as well?
Yeah, so 100%. So something I talk a lot about is healthcare disparities, and the wildly different outcomes people from different demographic groups have by participating in the same healthcare system. I often point to Baltimore because I think it's just, you know, such a great example where you can get a map. I have in a talk that shows the life expectancy in Baltimore by neighborhood, and it varies by up to 15 years, which is a huge difference. And these neighborhoods are sometimes adjoining neighborhoods. So it's not that they live in a different city. It's not that they have, you know, like there's a famine in Maryland, right? It's not that they don't, like Johns Hopkins has multiple hospitals throughout the city, right? So the tools are there, and yet people have wildly different outcomes. Right. So when we think about, oh, well, let's deploy this technology and it will be great, it will help everyone. That's not how any of the other things in medicine work, right? Like we deploy all sorts of treatments and medications and therapies that don't affect everyone, that don't improve everyone's lives. And so I don't know why technology would behave in some different way. And so where should you spend your time? How should you think about it? How should you be developing and deploying these technologies? A lot of the data that we have access to is biased in terms of the types of people it represent. And so there's a trade-off between doing the work to get other kinds of data versus you know, that time being spent somewhere else by maybe building a better system, right? So these things are really quite complicated. I think it is also the case that we don't really understand what our standards should even be. So let's say you have a piece of technology and you want to deploy it, and basically it brings the same level of care that people have, but it just replicates on a wider basis, which might be a good thing. But that current level of care has certain disparities in it. So even though you're not making those disparities better or worse in a numeric sense about like percentages, you're exposing more people to it. Is that bad or good? if your technology makes things better, right, but we still know that it's furthering disparities, is that okay? Right? If it changes, it shifts it, and it creates disparities to groups that are not currently experiencing them, right? But it reduces disparities in traditionally underrepresented groups. Is that okay? And I don't think, first of all, I don't think we have a great way of even measuring or understanding these problems. I don't think we have a good way of making decisions about these problems either. And so I think, unfortunately, what's happening is we're just pushing technology out, right? Because we're looking, is this radiology tool improve this kind of data? Yes, it does. Okay, let's just use it. And we're going very, very fast. But the reality is that a lot of these decisions about who is being impacted, how does it harm them, how does it benefit them, those take a lot of time to answer those questions. And we just don't have the time to do it with the speed that people are pushing things out.
The speed is an interesting question as well. I mean, I talk about this a lot with my students. 20 years ago, to do this scale of research, you had to have $1 million NIH grant in a lab, and you would have been a professor with all kinds of training and sort of skin in the game. And that was one of the ways that we made sure things were always done ethically and aligned with institutional, policies and norms. But now one of our students can go, write a script and end up with and grab 250,000, Instagram profile images, by tomorrow morning and start deploying algorithms.
Yeah.
And it's we don't have structures in place to force people to sort of slow down and be cautious. I think this is an interesting challenge, given the powerful tools we have to do our research that may not align with the norms and the practices of the past, and that kind of connects to a question that just popped up from one of our attendees about navigating the current understanding of ethics in our space, and how do we sort of innovate and push things forward. And this attendee brings up the example from medicine, where in the past, seems there was a researcher, I'm not familiar with this researcher, but Andreas Veslius, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, dug up graves to collect data when it was unethical to dig up graves, but push forward our understanding of human anatomy, dramatically because of that action. So perhaps the ends, may have justified that. Are we seeing, similar tensions now where, if only I could do this research and use this data, I will unlock, some knowledge, and I guess perhaps we don't know what we might unlock. So do we, how do we sort of balance that, the newness of the tools and the techniques we have, and are our current ethical guidelines holding us back in some way because they're stuck in an earlier way of looking at things? And I'm not sure if I'm articulating this properly, but I just don't know if you had any reflections on that.
Right. So this issue has been around for a very long time. It is clear that there are many important medical discoveries that originate from studies or behaviors that we would now deem as unethical. That is a famous one. It used to be that you couldn't get bodies to do anything with for science, and so literally, people would dig up graves, and that's how we learned about anatomy. That's not necessary anymore because now there are ways to get cadavers, but that used to not be the case. And the work that came out of there is unquestionably helpful and provides a basis for what we understand about the anatomy of the human body. This is a pervasive topic when it comes to developments around medical developments from World War II, from using Nazi concentration camp prisoners. There are many, many examples of that. There are, there's a robust debate around Hopkins practices, the HeLa cells around Henrietta Lacks. So this has been present for a long time. And the problem is that it is definitely true that important medical advances come from violations of ethical principles. And in retrospect, we even might want to say in some cases that the medicine that we gained and the medical knowledge we gained, I'm just talking about medicine here because that's where most of the cases are, the medical knowledge we gained was worth it for whatever that means, right? The problem, though, is that how do you make those kinds of decisions? Because everyone who does something that an IRB deems as unethical did it, and I shouldn't say everyone, but most people didn't do it because they were bad people or because, they don't care. They usually do it because they feel strongly that, the risks are minimal, or the medical knowledge that would be gained is worth it, right? There are cases of just outright malice. So I think like the syphilis, the cases of syphilis in the African-American population in the United States are like, clearly like they just didn't care, right? And maybe it's more complicated than that, but I think that's kind of the perception there. But in most cases, like the people who want to step outside the ethical norms feel justified in doing it. And they might be, actually. Like, I'm not saying they're always wrong, they might be right. The problem is that how do you then build a system where you say, here are the rules we're going to follow, you have to get approval to violate these rules, but then like if you just feel really strongly that you should violate the rules, then you can go ahead. Like, we can't have a system like that.
Right.
And I understand that this means that we are eliminating the ability to do work that is actually important, but I don't know of a better system, right? I don't know of a system that will make the perfect decision every time. That doesn't exist. And I don't know of a system where you can rest responsibility in the hands of the researcher and still say that we're actually doing what's in the best interest of the population. And so, sometimes IRBs get it wrong in either direction. Sometimes they say no to things that they should have said yes to. And we have modern examples where universities or organizations are sued or punished for doing research that was IRB approved that ended up being unethical. Right. And obviously, in those cases, I shouldn't say obviously, but many of those cases, the people involved in the research still don't think it was unethical. They still think that, okay, in the end, we agree, like we violated the rules, but it was completely justified in this case. I just don't have a better way of doing this. I don't have a way where we can say like, yes, it is like people should be able to violate the rules without consequence when they feel strongly. I think what we need to do is we need to like develop better systems and better rules, but that's obviously very hard to do. And it's not a magical thing we can just make happen.
Yeah, that's our challenge. And I think, maybe that's a good place for us to create sort of a closing question. One of our goals with the PERVADE project was to help, illuminate a lot of these issues, a lot of these challenges. And we're a team of social scientists and ethicists and anthropologists, exploring the space, understanding the space. And I guess maybe I'm curious from your perspective as a researcher, working in this space and working in the particular space dealing with medical informatics and public health, what should we be doing next? If we can go get another 5 years from the NSF, what would be helpful? What is it that we could do to help make these kinds of conversations in your space push the needle forward?
Right. So I think these conversations are very helpful. Something that is happening, which I think is good, is that the people who care about these issues that are invested in them are having these types of conversations. And that's really important and wasn't necessarily happening not that long ago. And so I think that's great. The problem is that most people are not, like us, where like we're going to spend an hour of our time attending a webinar on ethics, right? It's not like I'm interested and I'm here because like I do research on this topic. I'm fascinated by it. I want to learn more about it, et cetera. But that's not most people. Most people just need guidelines. And so the question is like, how do we produce those kinds of guidelines? And this is a very broad question right now that the entire AI community, I think, is struggling with. I think if you look, for example, at many governments, the EU, for example, there is a recognition that they need to provide some guidance and some regulations around AI very broadly, and that would encapsulate a lot of what we're talking about here. They just don't know what to do. And I think the people who work in this space, not everyone, but many of the people who work in this space also would like regulations, because it's nice operating where there's no regulations, because then you can do anything you want. It's not good operating when you know there should be regulations and they're coming, but you have no idea what they're going to be. Right. And that's really a problem. And I think like, I don't know how to solve that, because the challenge is that things are moving so quickly here and changing so rapidly, and the future is so unclear that we really don't know what are the right regulations to have, right? The conversation used to be all about like autonomous weapon systems or, like leaking private data, right? And those are still important, but that's not where people are going, right? People are going and addressing very different things. So how do we develop those guidelines, both in terms of like just within our community of writing papers with guidelines, informing IRBs, teaching classes, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do. But then the much bigger question of informing regulators. How do regulators decide what is okay, what is not okay? How do they provide guidelines that companies and organizations can develop technology knowing that it's acceptable or not acceptable? And right now, there's too much ambiguity on what the rules should be. But I don't quite know how to solve that problem because there's so much ambiguity about what the future will be.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. I think that's what's exciting us to do this kind of work and really pursue this. And so I really, again, thank you for taking the time today to share your work and your perspectives on this. It's been really helpful just for me, just having this conversation now, and hopefully for our attendees. And again, we'll be posting this on our PERVADE website and through our channels. And it's great to have this as part of our broader set of conversations. So Mark, thank you so much. Thank you
for
all
having me.
for attending. Absolutely. And I hope everyone stays healthy, and we'll see you all at our next in conversations with PERVADE. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.